Hey everyone, I am Dr. Flux, and this is General Psychology. Welcome back to the final lecture of Module 4. So far, we've explored the powerful ways that we learn through classical and operant conditioning. From Pavlov's dogs salivating at the sound of a metronome to Skinner's pigeons spinning for food, we've seen how associations shape our behavior in profound ways. But learning doesn't always serve us forever, does it? Sometimes we need to undo what we've learned. That's our focus today. How do we break associations, unlearn behaviors, or extinguish habits that no longer serve us? Before we dive in, let's test your recall with a couple of review questions from our last lecture on operant conditioning. What is the main difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement? A. Positive reinforcement decreases behavior, while negative reinforcement increases it. B. Positive reinforcement adds a desirable stimulus, while negative reinforcement removes an aversive one. C. Positive reinforcement strengthens behavior, while negative reinforcement weakens it. Or D. Positive reinforcement adds a stimulus, while negative reinforcement subtracts one, regardless of outcome. The correct answer is B. Positive reinforcement adds a desirable stimulus, like a reward, to strengthen behavior, while negative reinforcement removes an aversive stimulus to achieve the same effect. Which reinforcement schedule leads to the highest and most consistent rates of responding? A. Fixed ratio, B. Variable ratio, C. Fixed interval, or D. Variable interval? The answer here is B. Variable ratio. This schedule, used in things like slot machines, keeps individuals engaged because the reward is unpredictable but always possible. Now let's turn our attention to unlearning. Think about this. Have you ever wished you could undo a fear or forget a bad habit? Some forms of learning, like riding a bike, feel nearly indelible, so robust that once learned, they're nearly impossible to erase. But is that truly the case? Today, we'll explore techniques that challenge this idea. We'll ask the question, what does it mean to forget? We'll explore methods like habituation, systematic desensitization, counterconditioning, and extinction learning. These approaches show us how to weaken associations or even replace them altogether. As always, let's keep in mind our guiding principle. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Each of the techniques we'll discuss offers a framework for unlearning, but none of them are perfect or universal. Understanding their strengths and limits will help you to apply them thoughtfully. Let's start with a simple but puzzling question. Can you truly forget how to ride a bike? For many of us, the answer feels like a firm no. Certain learned behaviors seem so ingrained that we can't imagine them fading away. But what does it mean to forget a behavior? Are we talking about erasing a memory, breaking an association, or simply losing the motivation to act? Forgetting in the context of behavior is not as straightforward as pressing the delete key. Instead, it's more like overwriting an old program with a new one. When we talk about undoing learning, we're exploring techniques that weaken, replace, or disrupt the connections that we've built. Think back to the models we've studied so far. In classical conditioning, we learned that behaviors are tied to associations between stimuli. In operant conditioning, behaviors are strengthened or weakened by consequences. Forgetting, or unlearning, happens when these connections break down. But here's a catch. Just because a behavior isn't visible doesn't mean it's truly gone. Sometimes those connections linger in the background, waiting for the right conditions to reemerge. Let's reflect on your own experiences. Think of a skill or habit that you haven't practiced in a while. Maybe it's playing an instrument, speaking a foreign language. Do you feel that you've forgotten it entirely? Or does some part of it resurface when you're exposed to the right trigger? These questions remind us that forgetting is rarely absolute. It's about reshaping the pathways our brains have built. Now that we've unpacked the idea of forgetting, let's move into the first method for breaking associations: habituation. This technique leans on repetition and exposure to reduce responses to stimuli over time. Imagine walking into a room with a strong, unpleasant smell. At first, it's overwhelming, but after a while, you hardly notice it. This is habituation in action, our brain's way of tuning out repetitive or unimportant stimuli. In behavioral psychology, habituation takes on a more deliberate role. It's a technique used to weaken a learned association by flooding the individual with a stimulus until the response fades. Habituation operates on a simple principle. Repeated exposure without consequences reduces the emotional or physiological response to a stimulus. Over time, the brain learns that the stimulus isn't dangerous, and the reaction diminishes. Habituation happens all around us. Have you ever gotten used to a strong-smelling perfume? Stopped noticing a ticking clock? Adapted to the cold water of a pool after jumping in? Or gotten used to the noise of a busy street after living on it for a while? These are everyday examples of how our brain adjusts to repeated stimuli, showing that habituation is a natural part of our learning systems. Flooding is a form of habituation involving confronting the individual with the most intense version of a feared stimulus. Let's look at a few examples. A person who's terrified of dogs might be placed in a controlled setting with a calm dog. Initially, their fear response spikes, but as they spend more time with the dog, their brain begins to recalibrate, learning that the animal isn't a threat. Someone with acrophobia, or a fear of heights, could start by standing on a high balcony. With prolonged exposure, their fear response would gradually subside. Someone with a fear of public speaking could repeatedly present themselves in front of large audiences, even under stressful conditions, until they're desensitized to that fear. While habituation can be effective, it's not without risks. Flooding in particular can be overwhelming or even counterproductive if not handled carefully. Imagine forcing someone terrified of spiders into a room full of them. It could backfire, reinforcing the fear rather than extinguishing it. That's why habituation or flooding should always be conducted under the guidance of a trained professional who can ensure a controlled and supportive environment. The goal is to avoid re-traumatization and help the individual feel safe enough to process the experience. Let's do an attention check. Which of the following best describes the psychological condition of habituation? Is it A, a decrease in response to a stimulus after repeated exposure to it? B, an increase in sensitivity to a stimulus over time? C, the process of associating two stimuli to produce a learned response? Or D, the reappearance of a previously extinguished response after a rest period? The correct answer here is A. Habituation describes a decreased response to a stimulus after an organism has been exposed to it repeatedly. Now that we've explored habituation, let's transition to a gentler approach for undoing learned associations: systematic desensitization. Imagine trying to overcome a fear of spiders. Would you lock yourself in a room filled with tarantulas? If that seems terrifying and overwhelming, systematic desensitization might be an approach for you, because this technique helps individuals confront fears step by step, rather than flooding them with their fears. It pairs gradual exposure with relaxation techniques to reduce anxiety. While habituation floods the system, systematic desensitization offers a ladder, letting you climb one rung at a time. Systematic desensitization follows a structured three-step process. It begins with relaxation training. Before tackling the fear, an individual learns relaxation techniques such as deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, or guided visualization. These skills become tools to manage anxiety during exposure. For example, someone afraid of flying might practice calming breaths to steady themselves during moments of anxiety. Next, you create a fear hierarchy. Together with a therapist, the individual identifies a series of fear-inducing stimuli, arranged from least to most intimidating. For a fear of spiders, the hierarchy might start with looking at cartoon images of spiders and progress to being in the same room with a live spider. Finally, there's gradual exposure. Starting with the least fear-inducing stimulus, the individual confronts each step of the hierarchy while using relaxation techniques. Only when they feel comfortable do they move to the next step. As an example, for someone with a fear of public speaking, this might begin with practicing in front of a mirror, then presenting something to a close friend, and eventually speaking in front of a larger audience. Systematic desensitization is effective because it helps break the association between the feared stimulus and the fear response. By gradually confronting fears in a controlled way, individuals learn that the stimulus isn't as threatening as it seems. Relaxation techniques further reinforce this learning by counteracting the anxiety. While both habituation and systematic desensitization aim to reduce fear responses, The key difference lies in their pacing. Habituation is like diving into the deep end. It's intense and fast. Systematic desensitization is like wading in step by step, gentle and controlled. For individuals with severe phobias or intense anxiety, systematic desensitization is often the more humane and effective option. Next, we'll explore a technique that goes beyond reducing fears. It replaces them with positive associations. Imagine a dog terrified of a vacuum cleaner. Every time it's turned on, the dog trembles or hides. But what if we could rewrite that fear response, turning the vacuum cleaner from a source of terror into a signal for treats and belly rubs? That's the essence of counterconditioning, a technique designed to replace an undesired response with a more positive or adaptive one. Counterconditioning changes the emotional and behavioral associations tied to a stimulus by pairing it with a new, desirable experience. It's not just about eliminating fear, it's about transforming it into something better. Counterconditioning involves 3 steps: identifying the problematic association, pinpointing the stimulus that elicits the undesired response. Next is introducing a positive stimulus, pairing the problematic stimulus with something pleasant or rewarding. And the third is reinforcing the new association, consistently rewarding the desired response until a new association becomes stronger than the old one. In our dog example, this might involve a dog associating a vacuum cleaner with fear and barking at it continuously. That would be identifying the problem. Next, we'd offer the dog treats whenever the vacuum is in the room to begin a new association. Finally, over time and consistent reinforcement, the dog begins to associate the vacuum cleaner with treats rather than with fear. Counterconditioning works by leveraging the brain's capacity to form new connections. By repeatedly introducing a positive stimulus, the old negative association weakens over time. This technique highlights one of the most helpful aspects of learning: our ability to rewrite learned responses. Let's reflect. Think about a situation or stimulus that elicits a negative response from you. How might you introduce a positive element to change that association? For example, could you play calming music to make a stressful task more manageable? Could you reward yourself after facing something challenging? This process can be applied to many areas of life, offering a way to turn fears into opportunities for growth. Let's take a look at one last process: extinction. No, not that type of extinction. Imagine a dog that barks every time a doorbell rings. Why does it bark? Perhaps because in the past, barking resulted in attention, positive reinforcement, or scared away a perceived threat, which provided negative reinforcement. But what happens if the barking is no longer rewarded? Over time, the behavior fades. This process is known as extinction. Extinction occurs when a learned behavior diminishes because the reinforcement that once maintained it is removed. It's a cornerstone of behavioral psychology, highlighting the adaptability of learned responses. Extinction involves consistently withholding the reinforcement that sustains a behavior. Let's break it down with another example. Our first step is to identify the behavior and its reinforcer. For example, a child might throw tantrums because they've learned that it gains attention. Next, we want to remove the reinforcer, ensure the behavior no longer produces the desired outcome. Parents might ignore a tantrum entirely, removing the reward that attention provides. Finally, we want to stay consistent. This might end up taking a lot of patience from the parents, but the rewards might be incredibly meaningful. No more tantrums. Extinction isn't always a smooth process. 2 key phenomena might emerge. The first is an extinction burst. This is a temporary increase in a behavior's intensity or variability as reinforcement is withheld. In our tantrum example, this might mean a child begins throwing bigger tantrums when they no longer receive attention. There's also spontaneous recovery. This involves the reappearance of an extinguished behavior after a break or a pause. In our tantrum example, this might mean a child who stops having tantrums might test the waters weeks later to see if the old rules still apply. This is where consistency is incredibly important. Both of these phenomena remind us that behaviors learned over time don't vanish instantly. They fade through persistence and consistency. Let me give you a personal example. My car has a light that goes on, which is supposed to indicate that there's low tire pressure. When the light first went on, I would frequently stop to refill the air in my tires. But eventually I started to realize that my tires didn't need any more air. After repeatedly checking my tires and receiving no reinforcement that they had low air pressure, I finally started ignoring the light on the dashboard altogether. Eventually, when I was at a mechanic for a different reason, I learned that my tire pressure sensor had faulty wiring. Now I often have to remind myself to check the tire pressure if the light comes on again, because my learning was effectively extinguished by this experience. Extinction challenges us to examine not just the behavior, but the systems that sustain it. We've covered a lot in this lecture, exploring the ways we can undo learning and reshape behavior. Here's a quick summary of what we've explored. Habituation reduces responses through repeated exposure, often by flooding the individual with a stimulus. Systematic desensitization combines gradual exposure with relaxation techniques, creating a step-by-step path to overcoming fears. Counterconditioning replaces undesired associations with positive ones, rewriting emotional and behavioral responses. Extinction learning breaks the connection between a behavior and its reinforcement, with phenomena like extinction bursts and spontaneous recovery adding a bit of complexity. These methods highlight the adaptability of learned behaviors and offer strategies for addressing habits, fears, and challenges in everyday life. As always, let's keep in mind our mantra, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Each method we've discussed offers a unique lens for understanding how to weaken or replace associations. While none of these models are perfect, they provide powerful tools for growth, adaptation, and change. Before we conclude, let's do a bit of review. Which of the following techniques involves pairing a negative stimulus with a positive one to replace the emotional response? A. Habituation. B. Systematic desensitization. C. Counterconditioning. Or D. Extinction. The correct answer here is C. Counterconditioning. This method rewrites associations by pairing the undesired stimulus with something positive. What is an extinction burst? Is it A, the spontaneous reappearance of an extinguished behavior? B, a temporary increase in frequency or intensity of a behavior during extinction? C, the permanent cessation of a behavior due to a lack of reinforcement? Or D, the gradual replacement of an old behavior with a new one? The correct answer here is B, a temporary increase in the frequency or intensity of a behavior during extinction. This happens as the individual tests whether the reinforcement might still be available. As we conclude this lecture, think about the behaviors you'd like to unlearn or help others unlearn. These techniques are tools, but their success depends on patience, consistency, and understanding the systems that support behavior. Unlearning, like learning, is a process, a reminder of our potential for change. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of how we unlearn. I hope these insights empower you to think critically, engage meaningfully, and embrace that ever-changing nature of growth. Until next time, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. Flux out. I'll see you in the next lecture.